Have you gotten tired of isekai? Every year, dozens of stories come out about characters who are reborn in fantasy worlds, gaining new powers and completely reinventing their lives. It feels like there are more and more of them. Characters are reincarnated as monsters, slimes, swords, even vending machines. And it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. And the numbers back that up. Since 2013, the number of isekai titles has been steadily rising, from 11 a year to 25, then 33, and eventually peaking at 42 in 2021. But hold on. Let's take another look at that graph. The peak was back in 2021. Over the next 3 years, the numbers didn't grow. They actually dipped. 32, 40, 38, and in 2025, there were only 35 releases, and a large portion of those were sequels. So has the isekai boom finally passed? Why did it happen in the first place, and what might replace it? To answer that, we first need to understand why isekai became so popular to begin with. Isekai isn't a new genre at all, and it definitely didn't appear in the 2000s. The idea of being transported to another world isn't unique to Japanese media either. It's something you can find across global culture. You can easily draw parallels with countless stories from European literature and film, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Chronicles of Narnia, even Harry Potter. If you really stretch the definition, you could even call Divine Comedy an isekai. After all, the narrator travels through hell, purgatory, and heaven, which are, in a sense, entirely new worlds to him. But in anime and manga, this narrative device eventually took on a very specific, recognizable shape, and that's what made it so massively popular. So what does a typical modern isekai actually look like? It's usually a story about a loser, someone who can't stand their ordinary life. Maybe he's a bullied high schooler. Maybe he's a shut-in adult who never really found his place in the world. At best, he's an office worker, mindlessly moving papers from one pile to another. But in a new world, he finally gets everything he didn't have before. Friends, love, a real sense of purpose. And for the first time, his strengths are recognized and rewarded. How does he end up in this new world? Most of the time, it's some kind of accident, a traffic crash, or something as absurd as eating a poisoned meal. And the new world itself is almost always built on classic fantasy tropes. Elves, dwarves, orcs, full of clear nods to the Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons. An empty protagonist makes it easy to project yourself onto him, because in one way or another, all of us are at least a little dissatisfied with the real world. A blank, unremarkable main character becomes the perfect stand-in for the viewer, and the new world treats him kindly. It's fair. He finds powerful allies, good friends, and people who accept him as he is. It's the kind of fate most of us have fantasized about at some point. Classic fantasy tropes help too. It's familiar, not intimidating. Elves and orcs are as easy to grasp as the mafia, pirates, or Greek gods. The author doesn't need to stop and explain how the world works. Video game mechanics make these stories easier to write. Villains don't need deep motivations, they're just evil. And heroes don't need long training arcs. Their abilities unlock on their own after defeating yet another monster. That formula turned isekai into the perfect vehicle for cheap escapism. Predictable, one-dimensional, easy to consume. The audience always knows what to expect, and can jump into another title at any time. But like any formula, no matter how effective, isekai is starting to lose its impact. Endless simplification in the name of accessibility has turned many of these stories into boring fluff, something that at this point mostly appeals to a younger audience. Titles started to appear that tried to deconstruct the isekai formula. At first, through straightforward parody, like Konosuba. Then by flipping the premise, bringing characters from a fantasy world into ours, as in, the devil is a part-timer. And finally, through pure absurdity, turning the protagonist into objects or monsters. But eventually, even deconstruction hit its limits. Classic isekai stopped being engaging, and weird isekai stopped being surprising. And just when it seemed like the genre would quietly fade away, something unexpected happened, something almost no one really saw coming. It turns out that the rise of isekai ended up clearing the way for the very genre it originally came from, the one it simplified in pursuit of quick popularity, a genre with an even older history and a kind of mythic status. In other words, isekai's success has reignited interest in classic high fantasy, and we're already seeing titles that might signal the start of a new era. I'm not the first to point this out, shout out to Giguk and Paytalks Anime, but I still want to add my perspective and talk about how each of these works offers something far more unique, complex, and memorable than simple escapism. A dwarf, an elf, a human, and a halfling venture into a dungeon. Along the way, they run into monsters we've already seen hundreds of times: dragons, orcs, living armor. The party relies on magic and quick thinking to push deeper and deeper, trying to save their loved ones and uncover the mystery of this place. It sounds like the setup for the most generic, by-the-book fantasy imaginable, the kind we've seen 1,000 times, everything from The Lord of the Rings to Baldur's Gate. But that's the trick. Because Delicious in Dungeon turns out to have one of the most unique and carefully constructed worlds out there. Rokokui, the creator of the original manga, put an incredible amount of thought into how every part of her world functions. While isekai often copies fantasy tropes wholesale, Delicious in Dungeon uses them to constantly surprise the audience. At first glance, Kui's world seems familiar, same races, same creatures. But the mysterious dungeon turns out to be something else entirely. A massive self-contained ecosystem, almost like a living terrarium, operating by its own rules. You can grow vegetables on the backs of golems. Living armor is actually a colony of mollusks. And with the help of ghosts, you can even make something like holy ice cream. Every new monster is woven into the logic of the world, revealing a little more about how it works. They're not just mobs for grinding experience points. They're essential pieces of the story itself. It's no coincidence that the protagonist, Laios, is obsessed with monsters. He reflects the same curiosity and affection that Rokokui poured into building this world, and that same childlike sense of wonder the audience can feel when rediscovering creatures that once seemed familiar. Instead of the hollow fantasy backdrop you often get in isekai, this is a rabbit hole of lore, deep as the dungeon itself, and just as easy to fall into. Designing a solid power system for a fantasy world is surprisingly difficult. So most stories fall into one of two approaches: soft fantasy and hard fantasy. Soft fantasy leans fully into the supernatural and doesn't try to clearly explain how the world works. A classic example is The Lord of the Rings. There are wizards like Gandalf, but we don't really know how his magic works, what spells he uses, what his limits are, or what he can actually do beyond things like fireworks. On the one hand, that gives the author a lot of freedom to steer the outcome of battles without needing to justify every detail. On the other hand, it can leave the audience wondering why no one just flew to Mordor on giant eagles. Hard fantasy, by contrast, tries to rationalize magic and combat systems. The audience understands how fights work, and can usually tell who is more likely to win and why. This is the approach you see in Harry Potter, the techniques in Naruto, and of course RPG-style leveling systems in more formulaic isekai. Hard fantasy is generally easier to follow, which is why it shows up so often in anime and manga. There's probably nothing more straightforward, and at the same time, more effective, than putting numbers on power and abilities. It's no surprise that something like solo leveling is so addictive. But these systems come with a downside. To keep the audience engaged, creators have to keep escalating. The protagonist has to grow, the enemies have to get stronger, and the abilities have to become even more broken. Over time, this leads to a pile-up of terminology, endless explanations, and battles that start to feel less like action and more like commentary on a sports broadcast. You can see that happening in Jujutsu Kaisen finale, but let's avoid spoilers. Isekai protagonists almost always get overpowered abilities right away, often before the first half of the season is even over. It's all designed to give the viewer a quick hit of satisfaction. But that trick only works once. Sure, it's fun to watch yet another Kazuda defeat a boss and walk away with a full-on harem as a reward. But what happens after that? If it peaks at the very beginning, there's nowhere left to go, and the audience's interest can only start to fade. So, does hard fantasy always lead to a dead end? Not at all. The way a magic system works, its rules, its limits, and the ways those limits can be bent, is where actually things get interesting. For example, manga artist Kamome Shirahama came up with a brilliant, instantly intuitive way to portray magic. What if all magical power depended on how well you could draw it? That's the core idea behind Witch Hat Atelier, its anime adaptation from Bug Films airing right now, in spring 2026. The story takes place in a world where witches live alongside ordinary people, but the secrets of magic are treated as sacred and hidden from the public. Most people believe you have to be born with magical talent. But a 12-year-old girl named Coco discovers that magic is simply drawn and ends up becoming an apprentice to a witch. She has to quickly figure out how magical glyphs actually work. The symbols you draw determine the element. The direction of the arrows controls where the magic flows. The size of the arrow affects its strength. So, for example, you can draw a wind glyph with a massive arrow on a piece of cloth and turn it into a sail strong enough to carry you all the way to floating islands. At the same time, glyphs only work if the circle they're drawn in is completely closed, which means you can split it in half, say, draw one half on each boot, and the spell will only activate when you bring them together. And on top of that, different glyphs can be layered to create more complex, nuanced effects. It's a system you can understand visually, almost without any explanation, and it ends up being far more flexible and engaging than just putting numbers next to your abilities. At the same time, much like Delicious in Dungeon, Witch Hat Atelier doesn't use its fantasy setting just as a way to escape reality. It uses it to show you something genuinely wondrous. In this world, magic is born from drawings. In an age of AI and image generation, Witch Hat Atelier reminds us that real magic happens when you create something with your own hands. And also the real magic is the artwork of the manga itself. Kamome Shirahama has created one of the most beautiful and inventive manga of recent years. From stunning, storybook-like panels inspired by medieval illustrations, to breaking the usual rules of paneling and experimenting with page layouts, Atelier is constantly offering something new. It makes you slow down, linger on each page, study the characters and the spaces they inhabit. Notice the smallest details, and fully immerse yourself in this unfamiliar world. And that's exactly what these stories are meant to do, and what formulaic isekai so often fail to deliver. Speaking of tropes, what do isekai protagonists actually look like? Right? Yeah. Got it. Wait a second. Are these even different characters? They don't just look the same, they feel the same too. Completely, painfully empty. Also that any viewer can project themselves onto them. Which is a bit strange, if you think about the characters we usually love, Naruto Uzumaki, Satoru Gojo, Monkey D. Luffy, or Levi Ackerman. None of them are blank slates. They all have their own weaknesses and strengths, tastes and dreams, traumas and victories. They have a past that shapes them, and a future they're moving toward. And yet, for some reason, isekai creators decided that the only character a modern audience can relate to is an empty shell, a stand-in for the average viewer, as if giving the protagonist any distinct personality trait might break the immersion. But in doing so, they undermine the very thing that makes stories powerful in the first place. A good story lets you step into someone else's shoes, in a completely different world, and experience a life that isn't yours, safely and freely. And that's exactly what another recent fantasy proves. What if your main character is as far removed from the typical hero as possible? Someone who doesn't see defeating the Demon King as anything special. Someone who has watched empires fall, cities rise, loved ones grow old and die, while the world itself stays the same. Someone who looks at reality from an angle that isn't just different, but almost impossible for the audience to fully grasp. You probably see where this is going. Take a character like that, add strong direction, and a quietly emotional story, and you get Frieren. If you somehow missed what was widely considered the best anime of 2023 and maybe one of the best in general, Frieren Beyond Journey's End follows an almost immortal elf who experiences years as if they were seconds. For her, grand adventures feel like fleeting moments, while the people around her slowly, inevitably grow old and pass away. It's an experience neither you nor I can truly have. And yet, through careful direction, those quiet, time-lapse sequences that let years slip by in an instant, through her gradual character growth as she tries, and often struggles, to understand the people around her, and through reflective, almost meditative conversations about time and life, we begin to empathize with her. For a while, the viewer shares her perspective, becoming just as suspended in time as Frieren herself, and can even recognize small echoes of her experience in their own life. Instead of a blank, interchangeable protagonist who simply helps you escape reality, we get a character who offers a genuinely unique way of seeing the world, how we relate to others, and how we understand ourselves. We started by saying that Isekai rose to prominence through three key simplifications: a simplified protagonist, a familiar setting, and an easy-to-understand combat system. All of it designed so that anyone, from 6 to 73, could jump into any series and instantly understand what's going on. Those same simplifications turned Isekai into the perfect engine for cheap escapism. But is that really what we're here for? Is escapism the reason we watch anime, read fantasy, or tell stories to children? Or is it just a side effect of something more meaningful? Formulaic isekai started to wear thin surprisingly fast, just in a couple of years. But maybe introducing a wide audience to those familiar patterns was exactly what made space for something else. Stories that offer more complex worlds, more distinctive characters, and more imaginative approaches to magic. Without titles like Mushoku Tensei, Sword Art Online, ReZero, Konosuba, That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, and as a Vending Machine, though I'm not entirely sure about that one, high fantasy in the form of Frieren might never have reached this level of popularity or climbed to the top of my anime list, not to mention experimental culinary show Delicious in Dungeon or the dramatic art club that is Witch Hat Atelier. What we can do now is move past cheap escapism and really engage with these newer stories on their own terms. And if we do, maybe it turns out that a few years and a few hundred nearly identical isekai were a fair price to pay. Age of Isekai is over. Long live fantasy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss future videos. You can also find exclusive anime reviews and curated playlists from our essays on Patreon. Link is in the description.